In this new series or journey that we begin with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Awdatu ila al-Qur'an, the return to the Qur'an, the return to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins the glorious Qur'an wal Qur'an al-Majid, as we find inside Surah Qaf, the 50th chapter of the Qur'an, this glorious book, the glorious book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah uses these haruf al-muqatta'at, these various letters, these broken letters inside the Qur'an, some 14 in number that we find in different locations inside the Qur'an, whether it be alif lam mim ra, sad, qaf, noon, etc., that we find ha mim, whereby in general we find whenever these letters are mentioned, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins to speak about the Qur'an, about the nature of the Qur'an, the preservation of the Qur'an, the ayat of the Qur'an, and the dhikr of the Qur'an. And thus the Qur'an is no exception, whereby it begins with Surah Al-Baqarah, whereby it mentions Alif Lam Mim, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. Alif Lam Mim, indeed this is the book that contains no doubt, which is guidance for the believing individuals. هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ is a focus that we want to look at today at the moment, about guidance for the believing individuals. How come so many of us are so far or so aloof away from the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, don't seem to become the pious individuals, or trying to become the pious individuals, or have a bond or relationship with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And thus it becomes incumbent upon every single Muslim to exert themselves to the best of their ability to focus upon the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as we find in some narrations that the Qur'an will come and intercede for the believing individual inside the grave, and likewise inside al-akhirah. So our relationship and our link with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be strong, as we find inside the Qur'an, وَأَعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. O believing individuals, وَأَعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, hold fast to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And here numerous mufassirin give various different interpolations or interpretations of وَأَعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ. What does it mean to hold fast the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Either they highlight it means the Qur'an, it means the Sunnah, it means Ahkam, it means the Sharia, it means remaining steadfast upon the Fara'id. But all of these words, or all of these derivatives, are all synonymous words of holding fast the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, holding fast to al-Islam. But if we took the general meaning of holding fast, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ, of holding fast to the Qur'an, we find numerous narrations speaking about the Qur'an is Hablullah al-Mateen, is a strong rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that whoever holds fast to this rope, success will be given to that individual. You find such wordings inside a hadith, that the Qur'an is what gives strength, or gives glory, or gives might, or gives success for that individual. In هذا القرآن يرفع أقوام. Indeed, this Qur'an, it raises people, raises nations, and likewise it defames people as well. That is the power of the Qur'an. The book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins to raise the individual inside this dunya, and more so inside al-akhirah. So what is our relationship with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How much do we try to engage in making tadabbur of the Qur'an, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ أَلَا قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. Don't they ponder over the Qur'an, or is there shackles or chains which have been placed upon their hearts, which are preventing them from interpreting or accessing the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Another place in the Qur'an, Allah mentions كِتَابٌ أَنزَلْنَاهُ إِلَيْكَ مُبَارَكٌ لِيَدَّبَّرُوا آيَاتِهِ وَلِيَتَذَكَّرُوا الْأَلْبَابِ. Indeed, we sent down a blessed book down upon you, لِيَدَّبَّرُوا آيَاتِهِ, that you may ponder over its signs, the verses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imam al-Hasan al-Basri will mention لِيَدَّبَّرُوا بِمَعْنَى لِيُطَبِّقُوا آيَاتِهِ, that you begin to implement the ayat, the verses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we find that the believing individual becomes a symbol of the hadith in Bukhari, as narrated by Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, whereby when she was asked what was the characteristics of the behavior of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, فَقَالَتْ كَانَ خُلُقُهُ الْقُرْآنِ, that his characteristics or his behavior was the Qur'an. He was the embodiment of the Qur'an. Whatever was halal, he practiced that inside his life. Whatever is haram, he avoided that and stuck to all the awamir, the commandments, wan-nawahi, the prohibitions, the encouragements, etc. All of that was embodiment in the display of the Prophet ﷺ. as Allah mentioned, وَأَنزَلْنَا إِلَيْكَ الذِّكْرَ لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ مَا نُزِّلَ إِلَيْهِمْ وَلَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. We sent down the dhikr upon you, لِتُبَيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ, you may begin to explain to people that which has been sent down upon you. So amongst the prime role, or amongst the prime roles of the Prophet ﷺ is to describe the Qur'an, or to make tafsir of the Qur'an, or to explain the Qur'an to the people around him. So he becomes a living embodiment of the Qur'an, a practical example or application of the Qur'an, and likewise he becomes an academic institute of teaching the people around him what the verses of the Qur'an, what they mean and what the interpretation is, and specifically focusing upon the spiritual aspect of the Qur'an. That is what our journey that we intend to be, is to build our relationship with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to go back and to be able to have this relationship with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And thus we've selected in this series of 37 sections, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq and ability to complete them, is taken from Juz Amma. And the reason why we selected Juz Amma, the 30th Juz of the Qur'an, the final Juz of the Qur'an, is because many of us individuals, average individuals, we recite these surahs on a daily basis inside our salah, whether it be the end final 10 surahs that we may have memorized, or whether it be any other surahs from this juz, that even the imams, the imam, encourage to read surahs from this juz, as we'll mention inside certain ahadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So this becomes something which is on a regular basis, that we begin to hear these surahs, we begin to recite these surahs, we listen to these surahs, and many of us have this aspiration, ala aqal shay, at least to be able to have memorized one juz of the Qur'an. Juz Amma should be the bare minimal that a Muslim should have inside their life. So how many of us actually understand these surahs that we hear, that we listen, and we revise, or we try to learn them? How many of us really begin to understand these surahs and the impact of these surahs? So thus we decided to select to go into these surahs, to begin to study them and begin to extract benefits and fawaid from them. So because it becomes our daily ritual to have that goal or that relationship with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this study of the final juz of the Qur'an is after many years of putting together various aspects of reading and laying out a certain methodology to be able to bring things from classical works of tafsir and contemporary works of tafsir, and to place it in a modern light, in a relationship of helping us to develop ourselves spiritually. And not to say that classical works of tafsir, they don't focus on spirituality. Sometimes you're reading works of tafsir that you find it's as if it is at the moment of time, at the moment that this great alim, this great mufassir is speaking about our time and the problems that we're facing at the moment. And also that we find many issues of halal or haram, or issues that concern us. You find that classical mufassirin, or mufassirin who existed before, maybe centuries ago, have discussed these affairs inside their works of tafsir. So for mathalan, off the top of the head, that we find an issue that many people may begin to speak about, music, etc., that we find if we look at tafsir, works of tafsir, like Imam Suyuti's Ad-Durr al-Manthur in Surah Luqman, the 31st chapter, verse number 6, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَنْ يَشْتَرِي لَهْوَ الْحَدِيثِ لِيُضِلَّ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ. There's certain individuals who purchase any vulgar, idle, vain speech to take people away from the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if you read the works of tafsir of Imam Suyuti in speaking about the impact of music, or lahu al-hadith, and the false practice of it and the impact of it, begins to, as if he's speaking in our own times of the problems that we're facing. And as a side point, that we find that people say there needs to be a substitute towards those things which are haram, etc. The Qur'an is halawa, as even the Quraysh used to say, or it was highlighted that they mentioned, وَإِنَّ لَوْ halawa. Qur'an has this sweetness in the Qur'an, and reciting the Qur'an and pondering and listening of the Qur'an, that even the Quraysh at the time, those who were staunch enemies and showed animosity towards the Prophet ﷺ, they would listen to the Qur'an at night, and then they would promise themselves they would not come the following night, or make sure that the rest of the Quraysh begin to decipher or learn that they used to come and listen to the recital of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. If you read the tafsir of Surah An-Najm, the 53rd chapter of the Qur'an, the end of the surah that we find, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that going down into sajda, we find a sajda is placed inside the surah. You find that every single individual who's outside the precincts, outside the Kaaba, they're all prostrated due to the magnitude of the power of the Qur'an. So this is our intent of trying to develop the power, the magnitude of the Qur'an within our lives and spiritually within ourselves, and to look at these works of tafsir. So you find amongst the 12 to 15 or so of works that we've referred to, in the sense of going through each surah meticulously to go back and look at these classical works of tafsir to begin to extract these fawaid, these benefits from these great ulama mufassirin who existed before, and some of them even contemporary mufassirin who just passed away not too long ago. We find that ulama have mentioned that the benchmark for any work of tafsir that we find, or prior to that we should highlight about the Meccan and Medinan surahs that we find, even though inside these 37 surahs Juz Amma, we find that predominantly the 35 surahs are all Meccan surahs, and only 2 surahs, Surah Al-Bayyinah and Surah Al-Nasr, are Medinan surahs. And there's some ayat, some ulama mufassirin that make ikhtilaf upon that maybe these ayat are Medinan as well. But we find that Jamhur al-Mufassirin, majority of Mufassirin, go to the view that only Surah Al-Bayyinah and Surah Al-Nasr are classified as Medinan surahs. The rest of the surahs are Meccan surahs in nature. And the theme of Meccan surahs that we find is predominantly speaking about Tawheed, about belief, and speaking about the last day, about resurrection, speaking about Jannah, about Nar, about paradise, about hellfire, resurrection, about Qasasul Sabiqeen, stories of the past, people who nations were destroyed before, stories of the prophets, etc., and ayat of strengthening one's iman. This is the general theme of what is classified as a Meccan surah. And a Meccan surah doesn't need to be necessarily revealed inside Mecca to be classified inside as a Meccan surah. It could be even outside of Mecca, or whilst on the journey the Prophet ﷺ could have received revelation. A Meccan surah is classified as anything that was sent down in the first 13 years of revelation, whether it was inside Mecca, outside of Mecca, is classified as Meccan revelation, and that which is Medinan is the final 10 stages of revelation of prophethood, which is classified as a Medinan surah. So as we mentioned, that these 12 or 15 odd works of tafsir that we want to resort to, refer back to, and also those of us who want to have advanced studies and advanced readings, go back and look at these works and try to implement or try to begin to read these tafsir. So off the top of my head, some of the works that have been consulted regarding this is Imam Shawkani's Tafsir Fathul Qadir, Imam Suyuti's Ad-Durr al-Manthur that we find, likewise Imam al-Fassirin known as Ibn Kathir that you find has been returned to make tafsir or make extraction from these surahs. Likewise, you find from amongst the contemporary works of Shaykh Abu Bakr al-Jazairi, his tafsir in 3 volumes, and Imam Sa'di's tafsir as well in 1 volume that we find are contemporary works that a person go back and read these works. And there is no one tafsir that encompasses all material that a person could be searching for. So there's some tafsir which highlight Mawdu'u Surah, Fawaid Surah, like Imam Sabuni's tafsir Safatul Tafasir, whereby he makes a khulasa, a summary, reading various tafsir and putting them together. We find other tafsir like Ibn Ashur, after so many years of studying and pondering, he finally begins to write his tafsir. Likewise, you find Imam Shanqiti's tafsir Adwa al-Bayan, which is tafsir al-Qur'an bil Qur'an, and his son at the moment is currently making tafsir of Qurtubi inside Medina at the moment as well. So this goes from one generation to another generation, the impact of tafsir from father to son that we find. Also, we find tafsir, as we mentioned, of other ulama, like Tafsir al-Jalalain could be a good reading as well to begin to extract basic elements of understanding of the lugha, of the language of the Qur'an, and certain words that are placed inside the Qur'an, because Tafsir al-Jalalain is generally a holistic view in terms of every single kalima of the Qur'an is translated, or the meaning for it is given on the side, on the hashia, so it makes it a good reading for a person to do. And the foundation of any reading of tafsir, as ulama mentioned, is the tafsir of Imam Tabari. So even though these tafsir come at a later stage, most of them predominantly they rely upon Imam Tabari's tafsir in some 28 odd volumes or so. And the reason why sometimes ulama don't read specifically from Imam Tabari in the sense is that you find there is some Israeliyat inside that need to be sifted through. There may be a summarized version of Imam Tabari's tafsir that exists there at the moment, so a person can consult that. So in general, we look at the tafsir of Ibn Kathir, seems is a lot more authentic in the sense that he tries to keep away from Israeliyat, the Israelite traditions, and tries to, obviously where he does mention them, begin to highlight their authenticity. So the main aim is to firstly look at the relationship between one surah and the following surah, how one surah, the theme of it may spill over into the following surah, or the general theme of the previous surah comes into the following theme. This in itself is a science in itself. Imam Suyuti is well known for writing works or trying to extrapolate the fawaid, the benefits of the theme of one surah spilling over into another surah. And some ulama have mentioned this could be something which is which is something difficult, or trying to make extra extrapolations. But when a person ponders over it, you find there's a great wisdom in trying to make this extraction, because many times there is a link between the previous surah and the following surah, or the kalimat or the theme inside the previous surah. It will spill over. So for example, that we find surah Al-Anfal spills over into surah At-Tawbah. That's why there's no basmala, as ulama mentioned, because the theme, it carries on into the following surah. Surah Al-Duha and surah Al-Sharh, that we find many ulama would Qur'an used to read these surahs and miss out the basmala, because they would classify it as one surah, because the theme continues, the theme of the Prophet ﷺ inside surah Al-Duha into surah Al-Inshirah, Alam Nashrah Laka Sadrak. Likewise, you find surah Al-Falaq and surah Al-Nas, the theme, it spills over, runs parallel within these two surahs. So there is this extraction that can be made, that there is at times a clear link, and sometimes it could be a hidden link between one surah, one verse, and another verse. So after mentioning the different names of the surah the ulama have collected, then mentioning obviously firstly mentioning the link between the previous surah and previous ayat, the names of the surah, the reason of revelation of the surah, as Imam al-Wahidi has got a good book on Asbab al-Nuzul. But at the same time, not every single surah has a reason of revelation. There could be some surahs which have a reason of revelation, and some ayat which have a reason of revelation. So that we mention, and that which is not authentic, we may just brush it aside or mention it just for, in terms of fawaid and benefits, of how certain people place them inside their tafasir. Also, we find the fada'il surah, the virtues of the surah. Various works have been written about that, and some tafasir, they go to an extra effort in trying to write the virtue of every single surah, and collecting whether those hadith are sahih or da'if or mawdu or fabricated. They begin to place every single chapter heading, beginning it with a virtue of a surah. And this, as ulama mentioned, is something which is not healthy, in the sense that many narrations that they mention, whoever tries to write a virtue of every single surah, there are many narrations which are not authentic, of people who try to place the virtues of every single surah or write the virtues about them. Also, we find a mystical approach of tafasir al-Qur'an, where people try to extrapolate any hidden meanings of kalimat or huruf or symbols inside the Qur'an. This is going beyond the parameters of the tafsir of the Qur'an. For example, we find when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in Surah Al-Kahf about the dog. So now to try to extract what type of dog it was, what color the dog was, what its nourishment was, what size it was, what breed it was, as Imam Razi inside his Mafatih al-Ghaib that we find in some 15 odd volumes, Imam Razi, Fakhruddin al-Razi was a great mufassir in that sense, and not to discredit him in any way, but this was one of the, if we can use such words linguistically, the downfalls of Imam Razi, that he would begin to make these extra extrapolations from the Qur'an or within the Qur'an, and it would be a benefit, something which does not really benefit the awam. So that's some of the ulama, they would joke that inside Imam Razi's tafsir, fihi kulli shay illa tafsir. Inside his tafsir is everything except for tafsir, because he begins to speak about so many different things except for tafsir. And this is slightly harsh, in all honesty, because if you go back to tafsir Imam Razi, you find that he does talk about tafsir, and some of his usloob is jameel, is beautiful, that he highlights certain points. So from a certain ayah, he may extract 20 different benefits or 20 different things to talk about from that one ayah. So there is some benefit inside there. But as we mentioned at the same time, some of these works could not be for the average individual to go and approach these works and to extract these benefits. So we will at times touch upon these interpretations, highlight them, whether they are acceptable or not acceptable, or is there any link in the surahs that we find. Then we find that we try to enter into the general theme of the surah and extract benefits of the surah, and likewise maybe possibly to look at some linguistics that occur inside the Quran, how certain kalimat inside the Quran, what they mean and what the derivatives are, or linguistics in terms of changing of harakat, how it can have an impact on changing of the Quran. And we don't want to go too technical in this, as we mentioned that this wants to be a daily reading of the Quran, daily study. So we don't want to go too much into academia, rather we want to base more upon the concept of spirituality in developing that relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And thus we find also try to extract hidayatul ayat, extract the lessons from these verses. Abu Bakr al-Jazairi inside his tafsir, whereby at the end of each surah he highlights the lessons or the guidance that we learn from these ayat. So as I mentioned, that not every single book of tafsir will have all these points put together. Every single work of tafsir focuses on different aspects, different elements of sciences of tafsir, of qira'ah, of ahkam as well. That's why you find a numerous ulama of tafsir, they entitled their works tafsir of ahkam al-Qur'an. Like Imam Qurtubi, his initial intent was always to try to highlight the ayat of ahkam based upon the Maliki fiqh. And then instead he ended up completing the whole of the Qur'an, and it becomes a magnanimous work. And Imam Qurtubi was an Andalusian scholar, and not too far from us, a distance from this country that we find. So it shows that how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants tawfiq and understanding of his book, the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to various bilad, various places, and various ubad, various servants of his, that he opens up to them the understanding of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Also we find Ibn al-Juzay al-Kalbi al-Granati from Granada, that we find was a famous mufassir of the Qur'an, as well another Andalusian scholar. Likewise we find Bahr al-Muhit of Ibn Hayyan, that we find is Andalusian scholar as well, that we find Ibn al-Arabi al-Maliki, famous mufassir of the Qur'an as well. So this all shows how various ulama, how they wrote tafsir of the Qur'an. And the strange thing is that many of them, when they wrote tafsir of the Qur'an, you find a strong bond or a link between classical works of tafsir, or this methodology that begins to flow in all these works of tafsir about the narrations that they present. And also at the same time, some of them begin to make extra any extractions of fawaid, the benefits which others may have not found. And that is the beauty of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the more that the person ponders over it, the more the person recites it, the more the person reads it, the more the person begins to build this relationship with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the more fawaid benefits a person begins to extract. So even in this daily reading of these surahs, and this monotonous reading of these surahs, that some of us may, if they say it might find an element of boredom, is because we don't study tafsir. We don't have reading of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And possibly one excuse could be that there's only very minimal material available inside the English language. There is, however, Tafsir Ibn Kathir, which has been translated in 10 volumes, but even that is a summarized version of the full not of the full tafsir of Ibn Kathir. Is a summarized version, 1 volume, which has been translated in 10 volumes in the English language. So compare that to the various different books that we mentioned of tafsir, how they go into volumes. A person could spend the whole of their life reading tafsir and may not even get through one collection. For example, if we took Imam Tabari's collection of 26 or 27 or 28 odd volumes, and we try to read that through our lifespan, and I doubt any of us could, in that sense, get through reading the whole of this tafsir. So, and those who do, it is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, barakah inside their time. And if you study the time frame of some of these ulama, how long they lived for, and you see how many pages of tafsir they wrote and what they encompass, what they place, you find great barakah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed inside their time. Even ulama like Ibn Taymiyyah, they say about him that towards the end of his life, he said, if only I spent more time in the studying of tafsir and writing of tafsir. And this isn't a blame about Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah, it's just him being humble in the sense that he should have had more focus towards tafsir and writing tafsir of the Qur'an. And some ulama tried to collect some of his writings of tafsir that he wrote inside prison with coal, etc., and compile it together. So we want to focus on this concept of spirituality of the Qur'an being with us and being in relationship with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we read it, we're able to absorb the ayat, we'll be able to awaken ourselves with the reading these ayat, that the meaning of these ayat, they come to our mind, the reason of revelation comes to our mind, and it begins to build a relationship that the Qur'an has a impact upon us. As Allah mentioned, that believing individuals are those individuals that when they hear the Qur'an, it begins to shake in their hearts. A quivering takes place inside their hearts. وَإِذَا تُلِيَتْ عَلِيمْ آيَاتُهُ زَادَتْهُمْ إِيمَانًا. And when the ayat are recited upon them, it increases them in iman. وَعَلَى رَبِّهِمْ يَتَوَكَّلُونَ. And then we find it places an element of tawakkul, reliance upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala open up our hearts and our mind to be able to absorb the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.